At 10 a.m., 4 outboards screamed across open water, fast enough to tempt escape, slow enough to be carved out by a hunter circling 25,000 feet above. Somewhere in the eastern Pacific, the US military had eyes on a group of smugglers who just made the kind of mistake you don't get to repeat. Their boat wasn't gliding, but slicing through the waves at 50 knots, a silver streak against blue water. Fishing boats move at 12. Thus, these men weren't out for tuna. They were running for millions, unaware that their freedom had already expired 2 hours ago. Inside the go-fast, confidence filled the air thicker than diesel fumes. They'd done this run 18 times. It was the same ocean, same route, and same payoffs to keep the radar screens quiet. The helmsman's eyes darted between the GPS and the horizon, every reading on time, every coordinate perfect. Beneath the blue tarps lay $42 million worth of white powder. Split 5 ways after the cartel's cut, each man stood to walk away with roughly $2 million. Enough to vanish. Buy silence. Start over. 4 Mercury outboards screamed behind them, hammering through open ocean 140 miles from shore. Nothing around but endless blue. Freedom's best disguise. But 25,000 feet above, that illusion was already dying. An HC-130J Super Hercules had been carving wide circles in the sky since dawn. Its AN/APS-154 radar swept the sea in great invisible arcs, painting hundreds of contacts across its screens. One of them stood out at 8 a.m., moving too fast, off the main shipping lanes and broadcasting no AIS signal. 3 red flags. The sensor operator shifted to the Star Sapphire 380 HDC camera and zoomed in from 140 miles out. Through the stabilized lens, he could count the engines, see the tarps flutter, and watch the smugglers pacing the deck, confident ghosts who didn't know they'd already been found. By 9:45, a subtle change had happened. The go-fast stopped weaving and began sprinting straight north. Either the captain was feeling bold, or the fuel gauge was whispering bad news. The tactical coordinator lifted the encrypted sat phone. "Kimball, this is Eyes 1. Target steady, speed 50. Recommend launch interdiction assets." Within seconds, the message jumped from the aircraft to the cutter Kimball, to Joint Interagency Task Force South in Key West, and then to DEA monitors tracking cartel networks. Kimball was 200 miles out, too far to chase, too smart to try. She had better tools for that. At 50 knots, the go-fast's fuel window was closing fast, 4 hours at best. A helicopter could launch, catch up, and shut it down long before the tanks ran dry. The smugglers were charging north-northeast, likely toward a mothership or a coastal pickup. Standard cartel play. Run fast in daylight when radar clutter hides you among freighters. What they didn't realize was that they drifted into range of something built precisely for people who think speed equals safety. Hitting a moving engine block from a moving helicopter sounds like a stunt from an action movie, except the Coast Guard's hit-run unit had done it over 500 times. Today looked like number 501. The MH-65E Dolphin lifted off the Kimball's deck, twin turbo-mecha engines howling 853 shaft horsepower each. This wasn't the friendly orange rescue chopper from Hurricane News clips. This one had teeth. The pilot banked north, climbing to 3,000 feet for the best fuel economy. 20 minutes later, the co-pilot spotted it, a thin white wake slicing the sea like chalk on a blue board. 4 engines roaring full throttle, flinging water half a mile behind them. That's how you spot a go-fast, a line of arrogance written on the ocean. The smugglers were still running their counter-surveillance pattern, weaving left and right every few minutes to make it harder for surface chasers to plot an intercept. Against boats, it worked. Against an aircraft, it was like trying to lose a hawk by running in circles. The MH-65E cut clean diagonals between each turn, slicing the geometry of pursuit in its favor. Meanwhile, inside the go-fast, the math was turning ugly. 4 Mercury 300s at wide-open throttle burn roughly 25 gallons per hour each. With 400 gallons on board, they'd already torched half their fuel. 2 hours gone, 2 hours left, maybe less, given the weight under the tarps. Their rendezvous point was just 3 hours away. The ocean doesn't care about criminal optimism. Physics always collects. The helicopter didn't have that problem. With 4 hours of flight time and the Kimball waiting below with more fuel, time was on their side. The chase wasn't a race anymore. It was a countdown, and brutal one at that. At 11:45, the Dolphin dropped low, 500 feet above the waves, matching the smuggler's speed from behind. The pilot held a 500-meter buffer, close enough to control, far enough to stay outside small arms range. The compliance phase began. The co-pilot powered up the LRAD, the long-range acoustic device, and unleashed a voice at 162 decibels, louder than standing next to a rocket. English and Spanish commands boomed over the roar of rotors. "Stop your vessel. Prepare for boarding." This is the United States Coast Guard. The air churned into chaos. Rotor wash hammered the sea, spraying walls of salt water over the deck. But the smugglers stayed on the throttle. 5 men, nearly 3,000 pounds of cocaine, and $42 million in street value. To stop meant decades in prison. To run meant a miracle, and they'd take a miracle over certainty every time. 15 minutes of commands, sirens, and light signals. Nothing. The pilot keyed the mic to the Kimball. "No compliance. Request permission for warning shots." Approval came back instantly. The rules were simple. Out here in international waters, when warnings fail, the next sound the smugglers hear won't be a voice. At 12:15 p.m., the gunner leaned into the harness, hands resting on the grips of the M240B mounted to the side hatch. It was a belt-fed beast capable of spitting 650 rounds a minute. The first burst ripped across the water like a sentence written in fire and spray, tracer rounds skipping just ahead of the Go-Fast's bow. The M240B's metallic rhythm, that staccato hammering sound that turns adrenaline into instinct, echoed across the Pacific. Most smugglers see that, and their courage evaporates. These didn't. They shoved the throttles forward. 4 Mercury outboards screamed in unison, RPM needles buried in red. The Go-Fast danced across the waves, sharp left, sharp right, foaming turns that would have thrown most men overboard. Against a fixed-wing aircraft, maybe that buys you seconds. Against a helicopter that can pivot on its own axis, it's just a show. The gunner sent 2 more bursts, measured and deliberate. The message was clear, the result wasn't. These smugglers had made their choice. The pilot keyed the mic. Subjects remained non-compliant. The reply came back instantly. It was flat, cold, final, authorized. The gunner transitioned from suppression to precision, swapping the M240B for something with a different kind of authority, a Barrett M107 chambered in .50 BMG. Switching weapons wasn't escalation. It was an evolution from warning to mechanical execution. The man holding it belonged to HITRON, the Coast Guard's helicopter interdiction tactical squadron, based out of Jacksonville. The world's only airborne law enforcement unit is authorized to use what they call airborne use of force. Since 1998, HITRON crews have been the scalpel of the sea. Over 500 interdictions, $6.7 billion in narcotics erased from cartel ledgers. These are elite marksmen who train to stop engines from moving targets while moving themselves. Selection starts with the Coast Guard's top 1% of shooters. Then it gets brutal. Months of training at the Maritime Security Response Team's facility, shooting from rocking platforms in 6-foot swells, wind gusting at 20 knots, aircraft pitching on all 3 axes. They learn to breathe with the helicopter, time their shots to the rhythm of the ocean. By graduation, each gunner has burned through 5,000 rounds and developed an instinct that borders on the unnatural to predict chaos and pull the trigger between heartbeats. A stable sniper platform? Nah. They don't get that luxury. Their targets move at 50 knots, across living water that heaves, twists, and blinds. Salt coats optics, vibration numbs fingers, and wind steals bullets mid-flight. Hitting anything in that storm of variables is improbable. Hitting an engine block the size of a backpack? That's HITRON's specialty. The engines are the only target that matters. Sinking the boat creates a mess, evidence gone, people drowning, and paperwork forever. A disabled boat, though, That's a floating crime scene waiting to be catalogued. Outboards are perfect victims. Aluminum casings filled with precision parts that can't survive a half-inch slug traveling at 853 meters per second. One round, one engine, end of story. The Barrett M107 itself is a monster. 30 pounds of recoil and authority. Each .50 caliber round weighs 42 grams and carries over 11,000 foot-pounds of energy, enough to punch through a steel plate at 500 meters. Against an aluminum engine block, it's overkill in the purest sense. At 12:40 p.m., the first round did its job. It struck the starboard outer engine's powerhead and turned it into shrapnel. Aluminum vaporized in a black mist as oil and fragments scattered like confetti over boiling surf. The Go-Fast jolted, speed dropping from 50 knots to 38 in a heartbeat. The smugglers gripped their throttles tighter, praying 3 engines would be enough. They weren't. The second round drilled straight through the port outer motor, carving a hole where mechanics used to be. The engine seized and died in seconds. Now they were down to 25 knots, momentum bleeding away with every swell. The third shot looked effortless. It was the kind of precision that comes only when instinct and machinery sync perfectly. The round hit the starboard inner engine low, punching through the lower unit and exiting through the powerhead in a storm of parts. The Go-Fast slowed to 12 knots, limping, wobbling, trying to fight the ocean that was now heavier than their will. Only one engine remained, the last trace of hope holding the smugglers afloat. The fourth round ended it with brutal precision. The shot struck true, and the final Mercury outboard erupted in a violent burst of metal, oil, and white smoke. The roar that had once filled the air vanished in an instant, replaced by the heavy silence of defeat. Their boat drifted helplessly, rocking with each swell as the sea took control. There were no engines left, no speed to save them, only the vast, unbroken ocean stretching in every direction. By 1:15 p.m., the helicopter circled overhead, maintaining overwatch. Below, the Kimball deployed her response teams, 2 7-meter rigid-hull inflatable boats that slammed into the surf like wolves off a leash. 12 operators from Tactical Law Enforcement Team South, TACLET, are armed, armored, and trained for hostile boardings. They weren't coming to negotiate. Each RHIB carried a 6-man team in Level 4 armor, carrying M4A1, carbines, sidearms, and less lethal backup tools. Their 470 horsepower diesels howled as they skimmed the waves at 45 knots, converging on the crippled Go-Fast in a pincer formation that would have made any naval commander proud. The first RHIB closed to within 10 meters, coming in at a diagonal angle to reduce collision risk in the rolling swells. The lead operator rose from the bow, Beretta M9 leveled, and shouted commands over the wind. "Manos arriba, no se muevan, hands up, down, now." 5 men froze, surrounded by the very tarps that had once promised freedom. The second RHIB swept in on the opposite side, 6 more operators taking position, 12 rifles now aimed at 5 exhausted criminals. The ocean, silent witness, rolled beneath them as if holding its breath. At 1:45 p.m., the smugglers complied, hands high, faces down, surrender heavy in the air. But the mission wasn't over. Their vessel, stripped of power and purpose, was now a liability under maritime law. A stateless craft full of contraband, adrift. The disposal team got to work. They doused the deck and hull with accelerant, probably the same fuel that had powered their chase, and stepped back. One operator struck a flare and tossed it without ceremony. The fire caught instantly, a hungry orange bloom racing down the hull. In moments, the Go-Fast was ablaze, flames licking skyward like a signal of finality. $42 million in product, gone in smoke. They watched as it burned down to the bones, until the sea swallowed the last of it beneath the waves. Hours later, the smugglers were cuffed and silent aboard the Kimball, bound for a U.S. port, their empire reduced to ashes, their freedom exchanged for orange jumpsuits. The Pacific had gone quiet again, but somewhere in the sky, the next Hercules was already circling. The chase didn't last long, but its lesson did. Out here, the waves are ruthless, and so is the pursuit. For the U.S. Coast Guard, this was just another morning. For the cartel runners, it was the end of 18 lucky runs. What would you have done if you knew the sea was your only exit and your biggest enemy? Subscribe to see what happens when the next chase begins.